To the casual observer, Queen Louise of Denmark is just a footnote in history, a pretty British princess in a dusty oil painting who died too young. But look closer at that smiling face. There is a reason why, when she died at the tragically young age of 27, the entire nation of Denmark wept in a panic they had never felt for a king. This is not the tale of idle luxury. It's the dissection of a woman's endurance. It is the harrowing, untold autopsy of a woman sent into a lion's den armed with nothing but her charm. A woman who had to act as the beautiful mask for a rotting regime, and whose ultimate sacrifice was not on a battlefield, but in the birthing bed. She was the Queen of Tears, the woman who saved the Danish monarchy from destruction, only to be destroyed by it. While the court danced in the golden age she created, Louise was secretly holding the sanity of a kingdom together with her own trembling hands, managing a sadistic alcoholic husband and a genetic curse that would haunt her children. Her story is a ghost story about the crushing weight of a crown, the tragedy of a warrior forced to fight with a smile. She gave everything, her body, her joy, and her life to keep the lights on. This is not a fairy tale of a princess finding her prince. It is the story of a sacrifice. The roots of Louise's tragedy were sown far from the icy winds of Denmark. They were planted in a place of immense wealth, dazzling culture, and poisonous, visceral hatred. The royal court of London in the early 18th century. Louise was born on December 7, 1724, at Leicester House, the youngest daughter of the future King George II, and his brilliant, formidable wife, Caroline of Ansbach. On the surface, her birth was a cause for celebration, another Protestant heir to secure the newly established Hanoverian dynasty. But the air Louise breathed from her very first moment was toxic. She was born into the House of Hanover, a family seemingly cursed by a very specific, very brutal psychological pathology. The fathers loathed their sons, and the sons wished their fathers dead. This was not merely a disagreement or a clash of personalities. It was a blood feud played out on a national stage. Her grandfather, George I, had hated her father, George II. And now, as Louise grew from an infant into a watchful, quiet child, she watched her father, George II, direct a blinding, irrational rage toward her eldest brother, Frederick, the Prince of Wales. The palaces of London, St. James's, Kensington, Hampton Court, were not homes, they were battlegrounds. The king and queen referred to their own son, Louise's brother, as a wretch, a monster, and the greatest villain that was ever born. They wished him dead openly at the dinner table. This was the atmosphere of Louise's childhood. Imagine a household where the parents are the king and queen of one of the most powerful nations on earth, yet the daily reality is one of screaming matches, slammed doors, and a silence so thick with resentment it choked the air. Most children in such an environment would crumble, becoming neurotic or rebellious. Her sisters, Anne and Amelia, became sharp-tongued, bitter, and cynical, hardening their hearts to survive the crossfire. But Louise was different. From a terrifyingly young age, she developed a survival mechanism that would define her entire short existence. She became the peacemaker. She learned that in a house full of screaming narcissists, the only safety lay in being the calm center. She learned to smile when she wanted to weep. She learned to navigate the volatile egos of powerful men, to listen without judging, to offer comfort without taking sides. She became the favorite child, not because she was the most beautiful or the most brilliant, though she was both, but because she was the only one who offered a respite from the war. She was the soothing balm on the raw nerves of the Hanoverian dynasty. Yet, this role came at a terrible cost. To be the peacemaker is to suppress one's own self, To be the perfect, compliant daughter is to slowly erase your own desires. Louise learned early on that her value lay in her utility to others, a lesson that would eventually lead her to her grave. Her education was another paradox. Her mother, Queen Caroline, was perhaps the most intellectually gifted woman ever to sit on the British throne. She was a correspondent of Leibniz, a patron of the arts, a woman who debated philosophy and theology with the greatest minds of Europe. She ensured that Louise and her sisters were not merely decorative. Louise was rigorously educated. She spoke English, German, and French with flawless fluency. She understood history, politics, and court protocol. She was a talented artist and a musician. But unlike her mother, who wielded her intellect like a sword, Louise learned to hide hers behind a fan. She understood that in the marriage market of the 18th century, a princess could be smart, but she must never be threatening. She had to be a vessel, ready to be filled with the culture and expectations of whatever husband she was sold to. She was crafting herself into the perfect diplomatic weapon, sharp enough to be useful, but soft enough to be desirable. The first major trauma of her life, the event that shattered the fragile stability of her childhood, came in 1737 when Louise was just 12 years old. Her mother, the invincible Queen Caroline, died. And she did not die peacefully. She died a horrific, agonizing death from a strangulated umbilical hernia, a grim foreshadowing of the exact fate that would await Louise herself years later. The young princess watched as the strongest woman she knew was reduced to screaming agony, tortured by the primitive, brutal surgery of the day. The loss was catastrophic. Queen Caroline had been the glue holding the dysfunctional family together, the only one who could manage the king's explosive temper. With her gone, the court descended further into chaos. The king's grief was performative and overwhelming. He wept, he raged, he refused to change his routine, forcing his daughters to play cards with him for hours while he sobbed about their mother. Louise, at 13, 14, 15, effectively became the surrogate emotional spouse to her father. She had to manage his moods, listen to his repetitive stories, and act as the buffer between him and the world. It was an exhausting apprenticeship in handling difficult, damaged men. As she blossomed into young womanhood, Louise became the flower of the Hanovers. She was described by courtiers as possessing a majestic beauty, with clear blue eyes and a complexion of English rose perfection. But her beauty was not her most dangerous asset, it was her charm. Unlike her sisters, who could be haughty, Louise had a natural, unforced warmth that disarmed everyone she met. She could talk to a gardener with the same engagement she gave to a duke. She had the rare gift of making people feel seen. In the cutthroat world of 18th century politics, this was a superpower, and it was exactly what the diplomats were looking for. By the early 1740s, the great gears of European geopolitics began to grind toward Louise. The Protestant alliance needed shoring up. Great Britain needed a strong partner in the Baltic to counter the influence of France and to secure trade routes. The target was Denmark. The Kingdom of Denmark-Norway was a significant regional power, controlling the vital entrance to the Baltic Sea. A marriage alliance between the House of Hanover and the House of Oldenburg was the logical cold-blooded move. The diplomats began to whisper. Papers were shuffled in Whitehall and Copenhagen. The dowry was calculated. The girl was appraised. But what awaits Louise in Denmark? To understand the terrifying precipice she was standing on, we must look at the man chosen to be her husband. Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark was not a fairy tale prince. He was a tragedy in the making. If Louise's childhood had been difficult, Frederick's had been a psychological torture chamber. His father, King Christian VI was a man consumed by pietism, a severe, joyless, fanatical branch of Lutheranism. Christian VI believed that pleasure was a sin. He closed the theaters of Copenhagen. He banned dancing. He turned the court into a monastery of silence and prayer. Young Frederick, a boy of naturally high spirits and artistic sensitivity, was crushed under the heel of this grim regime. He was beaten, berated, and told constantly that he was a sinner, a failure, a disappointment. And like a coiled spring compressed too tight, Frederick snapped. He did not rebel with armies. He rebelled with his soul. He retreated into the darkest corners of debauchery. By the time the marriage negotiations with Louise began, the reports reaching London from the British spies in Copenhagen were alarming. The Crown Prince was an alcoholic. He was sexually voracious, preferring the company of prostitutes and low-born mistresses to the nobility. He was prone to violent mood swings. He was a broken, unstable man who drank to obliterate the voice of his father in his head. This was the prize that the lovely, intelligent 19-year-old Louise was to win. Did she know? Did the diplomats tell her the full truth? It is unlikely they told her everything. They would have used euphemisms. They would have said the prince was spirited or fond of gaiety. But Louise was no fool. She grew up in a court fueled by gossip. She would have heard the whispers. She would have known that she was not going to a romantic idyll, but to a rehabilitation mission. She was being sent to fix a broken man and to civilize a frozen court. The terror she must have felt is not recorded in the official letters, which are full of dutiful platitudes about serving the king's will. But one can imagine the sleepless nights in St. James's Palace, looking out at the rain, knowing that she was about to be severed from everything she loved, her brother William, her sisters, her home, to lie in the bed of a stranger with a reputation for sadism and drink. The negotiations were finalized in 1743. The dowry was immense, a staggering sum that underlined Great Britain's desperation for the alliance. But for Louise, the currency was her life. The wedding date was set. But in a final cruel twist of royal protocol, she would not even meet her husband at the altar. She was to be married by proxy in Hanover. It was a surreal, hollow ceremony. On November 10th, 1743, in the electorate of Hanover, Louise stood in her magnificent wedding dress, heavy with silver and pearls. Beside her, standing in for the groom, was her own brother, the Duke of Cumberland. She pledged her life and her body to a man who was hundreds of miles away, a man she had never seen. It was a piece of legal theater, stripping her of her autonomy before she had even left German soil. The journey north was a funeral march for her girlhood. As her carriage rattled over the frozen roads towards the Danish border, leaving the familiar world of the Hanovers behind, the landscape changed. The air grew sharper, biting. The days grew shorter. She was entering the dark north. At Altona, on the border of the Danish realm, the transfer took place. Her British entourage, the women who had raised her, the servants who knew her preferences, were largely sent back. She was stripped of her English identity and clothed in the expectations of Denmark. She met the Danish delegation, stern men in dark coats, eyeing the British purchase with skepticism. And then the moment of truth, the meeting. It took place shortly after she crossed the border. Frederick was there to meet her. One can only hold one's breath imagining that first glance. Louise stepping out of the carriage, shivering in the cold, looking up into the face of the man who now owned her. And Frederick? What did he see? He saw a woman of undeniable beauty, yes, but he likely saw something else, something that terrified him: expectation. He saw a woman who represented everything his father wanted him to be: regal, perfect, disciplined. He saw a judge, but Louise, with that genius for emotional intelligence, did not judge. In that first meeting, she deployed the weapon she would use for the next 7 years, absolute dazzling charm. She smiled. She deferred. She did not look at him with the eyes of a critic, but with the eyes of an ally. And Frederick, perhaps for the first time in his miserable life, felt a strange sensation, relief. She wasn't a schoolmistress. She wasn't a spy for his father. She was warm. They traveled together to Copenhagen, the capital city that was to be her prison and her kingdom. The entry into the city on December 11th, 1743, was a spectacle. The people of Copenhagen, starved of color and joy by the pietistic reign of the old king, lined the streets. They were expecting a stiff, German-speaking princess. What they got was a revelation. Louise waved. She smiled directly at the crowds. She radiated a charisma that cut through the gray winter like a lighthouse beam. To the Danes, she looked like hope. To the old King Christian VI, watching from the windows of the Christiansborg Palace, she must have looked like a dangerous injection of frivolity. But the deal was done. The princess had arrived. However, the honeymoon, if it could even be called that, was an illusion. Once the doors of the royal apartments closed, the reality of Louise's situation crashed down upon her. The fairy tale ended at the bedroom door. Frederick was not cured by her smile. His demons were deep, ancient things. He was still the alcoholic, insecure wreck he had always been. Louise quickly discovered that her marriage would be a ménage à trois: herself, Frederick, and the bottle. And there was a fourth presence in the room, the specter of his cruelty. Frederick, when drunk, was not a happy drunk. He was morose and aggressive. There are whispers in the archives, hastily written notes and diplomatic ciphers that suggest the Queen of Tears earned her title in the privacy of her own chambers, wiping away the evidence of a husband who could not control his own rage. Yet the morning after every dark night, Louise would emerge, her hair perfectly powdered, her dress immaculate, her smile fixed in place. She would walk into the court and play the role of the happy wife so convincingly that she fooled the world. She protected him. When he was too hungover to speak to the ministers, she spoke for him. When he made a drunken faux pas, she laughed it off as a joke, charming the offended parties until they forgot the insult. She became his public relations manager, his nurse, and his shield. She realized that if the people knew the truth about their crown prince, the monarchy would crumble. So she built a wall of light around him, blinding the world to the rot inside. But Louise had a greater ambition than just hiding her husband's flaws. She wanted to change the very fabric of the nation she now called home. She looked around the Danish court and saw a profound disconnection. The royal family was German. They spoke German to each other, German to their dogs, German to their ministers. The Danish language was treated with contempt, fit only for peasants and servants. It was a tool for ordering food, not for ruling a nation. Louise, the outsider, saw the insanity of this. She saw a people who felt alienated from their own rulers. And so, in a move of staggering brilliance and humility, the British princess decided to become Danish. She hired a tutor, Erik Pontoppidan, a clergyman who would later become a bishop. She sat down like a schoolgirl and began to learn the guttural, complex sounds of the Danish tongue. This was not a hobby. It was a political masterstroke. She insisted that her children be taught Danish as well. The news of this spread through Copenhagen like wildfire. The crown princess is learning our tongue. It was a gesture of respect that no Oldenburg queen had ever made. When she first spoke Danish in public, haltingly, perhaps with a heavy English accent, but clearly and proudly, the effect was electric. It broke the dam of reserve between the crown and the crowd. The people didn't just admire her, They fell in love with her with a ferocity that terrified the old guard. She wasn't just the king's wife, she was their Louise. She understood that power wasn't just about decrees and armies, it was about identity. By speaking their language, she was telling the Danes, "I am one of you." But while she was winning the hearts of the nation, she was losing the battle for her own husband's soul. Frederick's condition was worsening, and the pressure on Louise to produce an heir, the ultimate biological duty of a queen, was mounting. She was living in a state of constant high-wire tension. Every month was a cycle of hope and dread. Every public appearance was a performance. Every night was a gamble on Frederick's mood. She was 19, 20 years old, carrying the weight of a dynasty, a marriage, and a nation on her slender shoulders. And the tragedy was only just beginning. The winter of the North was about to thaw into a spring that would demand a terrible harvest. But seasons in a royal court are not measured by the weather. They are measured by the pulse of the monarch. The spring that Louise waited for, the moment she could truly shape her destiny, would arrive wrapped in the black crepe of mourning. The apprenticeship of the princess was over. The martyrdom of the queen was about to begin. As the old pious King Christian VI faded into the shadows of history, the gilded cage door did not open to set Louise free. Instead, it locked tight. The crown was coming, and with it, the realization that she was no longer just fighting for her marriage, but for the very sanity of the kingdom itself. On August 6, 1746, a bell tolled in Copenhagen, a deep mournful sound that signaled the end of an era and the beginning of a tragedy disguised as a triumph. King Christian VI was dead. The man who had draped Denmark in the black cloth of pietism, who had silenced the violins and closed the theaters, had finally succumbed to his own mortality. For the court, it was a moment of solemn ritual. For the people of Denmark, it was as if a heavy stone had been rolled away from the mouth of a tomb. And for Louise, now 21 years old, it was the moment the trap snapped shut. She was no longer just the crown princess, a guest in another man's house. She was the queen consort. The crown was placed upon her head, and with it came the crushing absolute weight of a nation's expectation. The coronation of Frederick V and Louise was not merely a political ceremony, it was a cultural exorcism. Under the previous reign, the court had been a place of whispered prayers and averted eyes. Now, almost overnight, it exploded with color. It was the dawn of what historians would later call the Danish Golden Age. And let there be no mistake, its true architect was not the king. It was Louise. She understood with a precocious political instinct that a monarchy cannot survive on fear alone. It needs love. It needs spectacle. She threw open the doors of the Christiansborg Palace. She invited the actors, the musicians, the painters, and the poets back from their exile. She commissioned operas. She held masquerade balls where the silk rustled and the champagne flowed. To the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale come to life. The young, handsome king and his beautiful English queen, presiding over a court that rivaled Versailles in its elegance. The Danish people were intoxicated by it. They saw a king who walked among them, who smiled, who seemed to embody a new, liberal spirit. But what they were actually seeing was a masterful performance directed, produced, and starred in by Queen Louise. She was the light that blinded them to the darkness standing right beside her. Because while the court danced, the king was disintegrating. The death of his strict father did not liberate Frederick. It unmoored him. Without the terrifying discipline of the old king to hold him in check, Frederick's demons ran riot. His alcoholism, previously a shameful secret, became a public reality. He did not just drink to be merry, he drank to obliterate consciousness. He was a man haunted by a profound sense of inadequacy, a man who knew deep down that he was unfit to rule. And so he abdicated his responsibilities not to a parliament, but to a bottle. This left Louise in a position of terrifying vulnerability. She became the de facto ruler of the court's social and domestic life, a role that required the stamina of a soldier and the tact of a saint. Imagine the psychological toll of her daily existence. She would spend her mornings with her tutors, perfecting her Danish, reading the latest Enlightenment philosophy, and managing the correspondence with foreign courts. Then she would spend her evenings sitting beside a husband who was often so intoxicated he could barely sit upright. She had to manage his slurred speech at state dinners, covering his lapses with her own witty conversation. She had to signal the servants to refill his glass with watered-down wine, or to gently guide him away from the public eye when his behavior became too erratic. She was the curator of his dignity, and she was doing this while her body was under a relentless, brutal siege. The primary duty of a queen is biological. She is an engine of succession. In the 18th century, a royal womb was a state asset, not a private organ. Louise, dutiful to the end, submitted to this requirement with a lethal frequency. Between 1745 and 1750, she was almost constantly pregnant. Consider the physical reality of this. The morning sickness, the exhaustion, the swelling, the pain, all endured while wearing the heavy restrictive corsets of the era, standing for hours at court functions, and managing a volatile alcoholic. Her first son, Christian, born in 1745, died before his second birthday. The grief of a mother losing her firstborn is a universal agony, but for a queen, there is no time to mourn. The death of an heir is a political crisis. She had to dry her tears and return to the marriage bed immediately. She had to produce a spare. In 1749, she gave birth to another son, the future King Christian VII. It was a moment of national jubilation, bells ringing across the snowy rooftops of Copenhagen. But looking back, with the benefit of history, this moment is drenched in a horrific irony. The child she birthed, the boy who was supposed to secure the dynasty, would grow up to inherit not his mother's brilliance, but a twisted version of his father's instability. Christian VII would become the Mad King, a schizophrenic tragedy who would bring the monarchy to the brink of ruin. But Louise, holding her infant son, could not know this. She only knew that she had done her duty. She had paid the blood tax. It was during these years that the legend of Louise the Beloved was truly forged. She began to engage in a subtle, subversive rebellion against the stiffness of royal protocol. She would walk through the king's garden in Copenhagen, often hand in hand with Frederick when he was sober enough, or with her ladies-in-waiting. She forbade the guards from keeping the public at a distance. She wanted the people to see her, to touch the hem of her dress. This was radical. In an age where monarchs were viewed as semi-divine beings, separated from the rabble by velvet ropes and bayonets, Louise invited the gaze of the commoner. She spoke to them in Danish, their own language, which she had mastered with a charming slight accent that the people found adorable. There is a poignant story from this time that illustrates her profound isolation. It is said that she kept a small private circle of friends, mostly women, to whom she would occasionally reveal the cracks in her armor. To them she did not complain about the king, that would be treason, but she spoke of a deep, abiding loneliness. She missed England. She missed her sister Mary, who had married the Landgrave of Hesse Castle. She wrote letters home that were masterpieces of evasion, describing the beauty of the Danish landscapes, but omitting the ugly landscape of her marriage. She was protecting her family in London from the truth, just as she protected her subjects in Copenhagen. She was the keeper of everyone's peace but her own. The masquerade of her marriage reached its zenith in the late 1740s. Frederick's infidelity was an open secret. He had a favorite mistress, Elsa Hansen, known as Madame Hansen, with whom he had 5 children, as many as he had with the Queen. He even set her up in a mansion on the fashionable Ulkegade. The court knew, the servants knew, the city knew, Louise surely knew. To be a queen in the 18th century was to accept that your husband's body belonged to his desires, while yours belonged to the state. But Louise's reaction to this humiliation was not rage, nor was it the cold withdrawal of her Hanoverian sisters. It was a dignified, heartbreaking silence. She never acknowledged the mistress. She never made a scene. She treated Frederick with an unfailing, gentle courtesy that must have shamed him more than any screaming argument ever could. Some historians argue that this was passivity, a weakness, but looking closer, it reveals a spine of steel. Louise understood that if she fought Frederick, she would lose. He was the king. He held all the cards. If she alienated him, she would be cast aside, isolated in a drafty castle, while the mistress ruled the court. By refusing to fight, by remaining the angel to his beast, she maintained her position as the center of the court. She kept her hand on the wheel of state by keeping her hand in his. It was a strategy of survival, executed with a discipline that is terrifying to contemplate. But the cracks were beginning to show in the porcelain. By 1750, Louise was visibly tired. The portraits from this final year show a subtle change. The smile is still there, but the eyes are heavier. The face is a little thinner. She had birthed 5 children in 6 years. She was running a kingdom's culture. She was managing a chaotic husband. She was 26 years old, and she had lived a century's worth of stress. The winter of 1751 arrived with a biting ferocity. The wind howled off the Øresund, rattling the windows of the Christiansborg. Louise was pregnant again, her 6th pregnancy. Her body, never given time to fully recover from the last birth, was pushed once more into the service of the dynasty. But this time, something was different. There was a pain, a sharp twisting agony in her abdomen that was not the familiar ache of carrying a child. It was something wrong, something internal. She tried to ignore it. She was the queen. Queens do not complain of stomach aches. She continued her duties. She attended the balls. She stood for hours receiving diplomats, the pain gnawing at her insides like a trapped animal. But as the pregnancy advanced, the agony became blinding. It was an umbilical hernia, a weakness in the abdominal wall caused by the strain of repeated pregnancies. A loop of her intestine had slipped through the muscle and become trapped. It was strangulating. The tragedy of the 18th century medicine is that it was often more dangerous than the disease. The court physicians were summoned. These were men of their time, learned in Latin, but ignorant of germs, anesthesia, or the delicate anatomy of a living woman. They gathered around the queen's bed, grave men in powdered wigs, debating her fate in hushed German tones while she lay sweating in the sheets. They made a decision that makes the modern reader shudder. They would operate. They believed that if they could push the intestine back in or cut the constriction, they could save her. But they were operating on a pregnant woman in a room filled with stale air, with unwashed instruments. Louise, lucid and terrified, surely knew what this meant. She remembered her mother. She remembered Queen Caroline screaming in St. James's Palace 14 years earlier, dying of the exact same condition. The genetic curse of the hernia had found the daughter. The trauma of her childhood was replaying itself in her own deathbed. Yet, even in the face of this horror, Louise did not lose her composure. As the doctors prepared their instruments, the knives, the bandages, the terrifying lack of anything to dull the pain, she began to say her goodbyes. She called for her children. She wrote to her family. She did not scream at the unfairness of it. She did not curse the husband who had put her in this bed, or the God who was taking her from it. She accepted the cup. The operation was performed. It is a testament to her unimaginable physical courage that she survived the initial surgery. But the relief was short-lived. Infection, the silent assassin of the pre-antibiotic age, set in immediately. The fever rose. The pain returned not as a sharp twist, but as a burning fire, consuming her from the inside. The Queen of Tears entered her final agony. In the hallway outside her chamber, King Frederick V paced. For the first time, the bottle could not numb him. He was facing the reality of a world without his anchor. He wept openly, a rare display of raw emotion from a man who had spent his life running from his feelings. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, what she had done for him. She had covered his sins. She had borne his children. She had loved him, or at least pretended to when he could not love himself. And now, because of the very duty he had imposed upon her, she was dying. Inside the room, the light was fading. It was December. The days were short. Louise drifted in and out of consciousness. In her lucid moments, she spoke to her ladies-in-waiting. She urged them to take care of the king, take care of him. Even at the end, her mission was the preservation of the man who had drained her. She worried about who would manage his moods, who would hide his drunkenness, who would smile at the people in his place. She was not just resigning a life, she was resigning a job she knew no one else could do. On December 19th, 1751, the struggle ended. Queen Louise of Denmark, the British princess who had learned the language of the peasants, the wife who had hidden a monster, the mother of the future madness, took her final breath. She was 27 years old. The silence that fell over the Christiansborg Palace was heavy and absolute, but it was nothing compared to the sound that was about to rise from the streets of Copenhagen. The news traveled fast. The queen is dead. And then the weeping started. That weeping was the sound of a nation realizing too late that they had lost their only shield. The death of the body is one tragedy, but the death of the influence is another. As the candles flickered out around Louise's bier, the darkness she had held back for 7 years rushed into the palace corridors with the force of a flood. The masquerade was finished. The music stopped. And in the terrifying silence that followed, the true cost of her absence began to tally itself, not in kroner or land, but in the fractured minds and broken souls of the family she left behind. When the great doors of Roskilde Cathedral closed on the sarcophagus of Queen Louise in January 1752, they sealed away more than just a body. They sealed away the conscience of the king and the stability of the realm. The grief that gripped Denmark in the weeks following her death was not the polite, performative mourning usually accorded to royalty. It was a visceral national panic. The people, from the fishmongers in the frozen harbor to the merchants in their warm counting houses, understood instinctively what had happened. The safety valve had blown. The one person who stood between the king's dark, chaotic impulses and the governance of the state was gone. They were alone with Frederick V now, and they were terrified. The collapse of the king was immediate and grotesque. For 7 years, Louise had acted as the dam holding back the floodwaters of his depravity. She had managed his drinking, smoothed over his rages, and kept him tethered to a semblance of sanity. With her gone, the dam burst. Frederick did not mourn like a man who wanted to heal. He mourned like a man who wanted to destroy himself. He retreated into a black depression, fueled by an ocean of alcohol. The masquerade ball stopped The Enlightenment conversation ceased. The court, which had briefly shone with the light of Louise's influence, dimmed back into a place of uneasy whispers and drunken shouts. The king's ministers, the men in the powdered wigs who ran the machinery of the state, watched this disintegration with cold, calculating eyes. They realized quickly that the king was broken beyond repair. He would never rule again, not truly. And so, a new silent coup took place. The power shifted from the throne to the council chamber. Frederick V became a ghost in his own palace, a figurehead who was wheeled out for ceremonies and then wheeled back to his mistresses and his bottles. He died just 14 years later, at the age of 42, a bloated, dropsical wreck of a man. But in truth, he had died the day Louise took her last breath. She had been his life support, and without her, he was simply a corpse waiting for permission to lie down. But the true tragedy of Louise's early death was not the fate of her husband. It was the fate of the children she left behind in the royal nursery. This is where the story shifts from a tragedy of marriage to a tragedy of blood. Louise left 4 surviving children: Sophia Magdalena, Wilhelmina Caroline, Christian, and the infant Louise. And standing over their cradles was the specter of a genetic curse and a looming, terrifying future. The most immediate victim was the crown prince, Christian. He was only 2 years old when his mother died. He had barely known her warmth before it was snatched away. In the vacuum left by Louise, a new figure entered the stage, a woman who would become the villain in the Danish national mythos, Juliana Maria of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Less than 6 months after Louise's death, a period of mourning so short it was considered scandalous by the people, the diplomats forced Frederick to remarry. The state needed stability. They chose Juliana Maria, a German princess who was the polar opposite of Louise. Where Louise had been warm, charming, and essentially Danish in her heart, Juliana Maria was stiff, formal, and fiercely proud of her German heritage. She did not learn Danish. She did not walk in the gardens with the people. She looked at the children of her predecessor not with maternal love, but with the cold, suspicious eye of a stepmother who wanted her own son to inherit the throne. Young Christian, the sensitive, intelligent boy who had inherited his mother's eyes and his father's instability, was trapped. He grew up in a court that was a psychological torture chamber. His father, the king, terrified him. His stepmother, the queen, isolated him. And his tutor, a brutal man named Relentless, was given free rein to discipline the boy. The historical records of Christian's childhood are harrowing reading. He was beaten, he was humiliated, he was forced to sleep with his tutor, subjected to emotional and perhaps sexual abuse. The boy who should have been protected by the memory of his saintly mother was instead broken by the people who replaced her. It was in this crucible of trauma that the Mad King was forged. As Christian grew, the cracks in his mind began to widen. He developed a frantic, nervous energy. He hallucinated. He engaged in violent, self-destructive behavior. Historians today believe he likely suffered from schizophrenia, exacerbated by the brutal abuse of his childhood. But the people of Denmark, watching their young prince descend into madness, whispered a different theory. They whispered that he was broken by grief. They said that if Louise had lived, if she had been there to shield him from Relentless' whip and Juliana Maria's coldness, he might have been whole. Louise's absence became the defining trauma of the next generation. She was the what if that hung over the madness of Christian VII. But there was another child in that nursery, a girl who was just an infant when Louise died, who would inherit her mother's destiny in the most terrifyingly literal way. Her name was Caroline Matilda. Born in 1751, just months before her mother's death, Caroline Matilda never knew Louise. She was shipped off to England to be raised at the court of her grandfather, George II. She grew up in London, a lively, chubby, innocent girl, hearing stories about her saintly mother who had been the Queen of Denmark. She was told that her mother was an angel, a martyr, a perfect woman. She was not told the truth, that her mother was a sacrifice. In a twist of fate that feels like the plot of a Greek tragedy, the diplomats decided to repeat the experiment. In 1766, the 15-year-old Caroline Matilda was married off to her own first cousin, Christian VII, Louise's son. The daughter of Louise was sent to marry the son of Louise. The bloodline was folding back on itself. Caroline Matilda arrived in Denmark just as her mother had, young, hopeful, and utterly unprepared. She walked into the same palaces, breathed the same air, and faced the same enemy, a husband who was mentally unstable and incapable of loving her. But where Louise had found a manageable alcoholic in Frederick V, Caroline Matilda found a chaotic, raving schizophrenic in Christian VII. And where Louise had possessed a superhuman patience and political genius, Caroline Matilda was just a teenager, passionate, impulsive, and dangerously naive. The tragedy of Caroline Matilda is the dark echo of Louise's life. Louise had survived her marriage by suppressing herself, by wearing the mask. Caroline Matilda tried to survive by living. She fell in love, not with her mad husband, but with the royal physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee. It was the scandal of the century. For a brief, shining moment, the Queen and the Doctor ruled Denmark, introducing radical Enlightenment reforms that Louise herself would have applauded. Freedom of the press, the abolition of torture, the care of orphans. They tried to build the modern state that Louise had dreamed of, but they forgot the lesson Louise had died teaching. Survival requires submission. The conservative forces of the court, led by the stepmother Juliana Maria, struck back. In 1772, in a bloody coup, Struensee was arrested and executed, his body quartered and displayed on wheels. Caroline Matilda, the daughter of the beloved Louise, was dragged from her bed, arrested and imprisoned in Kronborg Castle. She was branded a whore and a traitor. She was stripped of her children and exiled to Celle in Germany. There, in a cruel rhyming of history, Caroline Matilda died in 1775. She was only 23 years old. The cause of death? Putrid fever, likely scarlet fever or typhus. But those who loved her knew the real cause. She died of a broken heart, isolated and shamed, just a few years younger than her mother had been when she died. Mother and daughter, both British princesses, both queens of Denmark, both dead before 30, both victims of a system that consumed women to fuel the machinery of state. This is the legacy of ruin that Louise unwittingly left behind. Her death removed the keystone of the arch, and the whole structure collapsed on top of her children. If she had lived, she would have protected Christian. She would have guided Caroline Matilda. There would have been no Struensee affair, no coup, no execution. The history of Scandinavia would have been fundamentally different. But history does not deal in what-ifs. It deals in graves. And yet, even amidst this ruin, the memory of Louise began to undergo a strange transformation. As the reign of the Mad King descended into chaos, and as the scandal of Caroline Matilda tore the country apart, the people of Denmark began to look back at the reign of Louise and Frederick V as a lost golden age. They forgot the alcoholism, they forgot the mistresses, they forgot the pain. They remembered only the smile. They remembered the queen who spoke Danish. They remembered the walks in the garden. Louise was canonized in the secular religion of the nation. She became the symbol of everything that was good, pure, and lost. This idealization was powerful, but it was also a trap. It erased the real woman, the woman who suffered, the woman who managed a crisis every single day, and replaced her with a porcelain doll. It denied her the credit for her greatest achievement, her endurance. We must strip away this layer of nostalgia to see the true magnitude of her strength. She was not a passive saint. She was an active operator in a brutal environment. She played a bad hand with absolute mastery, and she folded only when her body physically gave out. As we stand at the threshold of the final chapter of her story, we must look at the long shadow she cast over the future of the British and Danish royal families. Her genetic legacy did not end with the tragedy of her children. It continued, weaving its way through the royal houses of Europe. Her blood runs in the veins of the current monarchs of Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. The Queen of Tears is the silent matriarch of modern royalty. But her story is also a warning about the cost of duty. It asks us a question that is as relevant today as it was in 1751. How much of oneself must a public figure burn to keep the lights of the institution burning? Yet, to linger only on the ruin of her children is to do a disservice to the woman herself. Having witnessed the devastating cost of her duty, we are left with the final, most difficult task of the historian, to judge the silence. Was her endurance a victory or a curse? As we stand at the end of this long, sorrowful road, we must weigh the gold of her legacy against the tears it cost to mint it. We stand now at the end of the journey, looking back across the 3 centuries that separate us from the snow-covered courtyard of the Christiansborg Palace in 1751. The candles have burned down. The music of the masquerade has faded. The weeping crowds have long since turned to dust. What remains of Queen Louise? If you visit Denmark today, you will see her name on streets, on hospitals, on the maps of the royal collection. You will see her face in the gilded frames of the Amalienborg Museum. That eternal slight smile, the pale blue eyes that seem to hold a secret. But a name and a painting are not a life. To truly understand the weight of Louise's existence and the terrifying magnitude of her sacrifice, we must strip away the final layer of the myth. We must look at the verdict of history, not as it was written by the sycophantic court poets of her time, but as it is revealed by the cold, hard facts of what happened after she was gone. The central question that hangs over Louise's legacy is a brutal one. Was she a failure? To the casual observer, a queen who reigns for only 5 years and dies at 27, leaving behind a traumatized husband and children who would march toward madness and exile, might seem like a tragic footnote, a victim of circumstance. But this view is a profound misreading of the mechanics of power in the 18th century. Louise was not a victim. She was, in fact, the most successful politician of her generation. She was a silent architect who built the foundation of the modern Danish monarchy, using the only materials she was allowed to touch: emotion, image, and her own body. Consider the sheer improbability of her achievement. She arrived in a country that was culturally frozen, ruled by a dynasty that had turned its back on its own people, married to a man who was essentially a functioning alcoholic sociopath. In 7 years, she reversed the polarity of the entire nation. She made the monarchy Danish again. She made it human. The golden age of Frederik Furter, the era of flourishing trade, of art, of the construction of the Frederiksstaden district, which remains the jewel of Copenhagen today, was built on the stability that she provided. She was the pillar holding the entire kingdom together. When we admire the beautiful Rococo architecture of 18th century Copenhagen, We are looking at a city built during the brief, sunny window of sanity that Louise held open with her own trembling hands. But we must also confront the darker side of her agency. There is a controversial argument to be made that Louise, by being so perfect, unwittingly enabled the disaster that followed. By covering up Frederick's alcoholism so effectively, by playing the masquerade so well, she allowed the rot at the heart of the monarchy to fester in the dark. She bought the House of Oldenburg time, but she did not buy it as a cure. She protected the institution at the expense of the truth. If she had been less compliant, if she had let the king fail publicly, perhaps the crisis would have come sooner but been less catastrophic than the madness of Christian VII. But this is the cruelty of hindsight. Louise did not have the luxury of looking 50 years into the future. She had to survive Tuesday. She had to survive the next state dinner, the next pregnancy, the next hangover. And let us speak of those pregnancies one last time. The medical history of Queen Louise is a stark indictment of the biological tax levied on royal women. In the 18th century, a queen's body was a battlefield. It was assaulted by the expectations of the state and the primitive ignorance of medicine. Louise was an intelligent woman. She knew the risks. Every time she realized she was with child, she must have felt that cold shiver of mortality. She knew her mother, the great Queen Caroline, had died a horrific death from a hernia. She knew that she carried the same weakness. Yet she did not stop. Why? Because she believed in the divine right of kings? Perhaps. Or perhaps because she knew that her value, her safety, her influence, her very right to exist in that palace depended entirely on her utility as a mother. She was running a race against her own biology, trying to produce enough heirs to secure the throne before her body collapsed. She won the race, but the finish line was her grave. There's a profound silence in the archives where Louise's true voice should be. We have her official letters, polite and diplomatic. We have the accounts of ambassadors praising her beauty. But where is the woman? Where is the anger? Where is the fear? It is found in the gaps. It is found in the fact that she surrounded herself with a tight circle of female friends and swore them to secrecy. It is found in the frantic pace of her social calendar, a woman running so fast she didn't have time to think. It is found in the eyes of her portraits, which, if you look closely, do not smile, even when her mouth does. She was a member of the House of Hanover, a family famous for its grudges and its fury. Louise took all that Hanoverian fire and swallowed it. She turned it inward. She didn't scream at her husband. She smiled until it killed her. The tragedy of Louise is ultimately a tragedy of wasted potential. She was the daughter of Caroline of Ansbach, one of the greatest intellects of the age. Louise had that same mind. She had the diplomatic skill of a Talleyrand and the charisma of a movie star. In a different world, a world that allowed women to rule in their own right, Louise of Denmark could have been Catherine the Great. She could have been an Elizabeth I. Instead, she was forced to be a bandage. She was used to patching up a broken man and a broken system. Her brilliance was dissolved in the wine of her husband's excesses. And yet, despite the brevity of her life, her legacy is surprisingly enduring. It echoes in the DNA of the royal families of Europe. Through her daughter, Sophia Magdalena, who became Queen of Sweden, and her other descendants, Louise is an ancestor of almost every modern European monarch. The current King of Denmark, Frederick VI, and the British royal family are her blood. The resilience that has allowed these families to survive revolutions, wars, and scandals. Perhaps some of that comes from the quiet, steely strength of the Queen of Tears. But her most important legacy is in Denmark itself. Louise changed the definition of what a queen could be. Before her, Queens were distant, German, and severe. After her, the ideal queen was someone who learned the language, who walked among the people, who acted as the mother of the nation. She created the template for the modern, popular, approachable Scandinavian monarchy. Every time a Danish royal rides a bicycle through Copenhagen or sends their children to a public school, they are walking on the path that Louise cut through the frozen etiquette of the 18th century. She taught them that to rule is to serve, and to serve is to connect. So, how should we remember her? Not as the Queen of Tears. That title, while poetic, reduces her to a victim. We should remember her as the Queen of Will, the woman who walked into the lion's den of the Danish court, armed with nothing but a fan and a lexicon, tamed it. The woman who faced the terrifying isolation of a loveless marriage and built a kingdom of love around herself. Imagine her one last time. It is the winter of 1751. The snow is falling on the marble statues of the king's garden. She is standing at the window of the Christiansborg, her hand resting on her swollen stomach, the pain already beginning to gnaw at her side. She looks out at the city she has adopted, the city that adores her. She knows the doctors are whispering in the next room. She knows the king is drunk in his chambers. She knows the end is coming. And she does not run. She does not weep. She straightens her back. She adjusts the heavy silk of her dress. She puts on the mask of the happy queen one last time. She turns from the window and walks back into the light, ready to play her part until the curtain falls. She was the white rose of the north, blooming in the ice. She died so the monarchy could live. And in the silence of history, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the echo of her sacrifice, a quiet, steady heartbeat beneath the roar of time. She was Louise, and she was the bravest of them all.